Welcome to the Women in Public Policy Program's Seminar Series podcast at the Harvard Kennedy School.
And you have a beverage. Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the opening of our second semester Women in Public Policy Program Seminar Series. I'm Victoria Budson, the Executive Director here. As you know, our work at the Women in Public Policy Program focuses on closing gender gaps in the areas of economic opportunity, political participation, health, and education, where many organizations that focus on issues of gender look at what the gaps are and how to measure them. We predominantly, though we do some of that work, we predominantly don't look at what they are or how to measure, but how to close them. And we identify replicable interventions which can be brought to scale to fundamentally close gaps in these areas. All of the work which our faculty partake of is focused on being applicable in the world, and then policy translation takes place from that, so that we're not just studying how to do it, but we're giving policymakers the tools to do it. In that vein, today we have Jeni Klugman joining us. She is a fellow here at the Women in Public Policy Program. She was director and ran all the work of the World Bank Gender Unit for many years before she came. We are so pleased that she is embedded with us this semester, and I hope that she will stay connected to us institutionally and organizationally for many years to come. Today she's going to deliver a seminar on voice and agency, empowering women and girls for shared prosperity. She holds her PhD in economics from the Australian National University, as well as postgraduate degrees in both law and development economics from Oxford University. She's also a Rhodes Scholar, and she is, in addition to all these things, completely lovely. We have enjoyed having her here so much. She's been a wonderful colleague already. And with that, Jeni, I turn it over to you. I want to remind everyone that, as always, the session will be podcast, so your voice and what takes place with the speaker will be recorded.
Great. Thanks very much, Victoria. It's great to be able to present as part of the WAPPP, I'll use the acronym, series today, and I'm very glad to be able to spend some time here as a fellow as well as teaching a number of you. It's great to see some familiar faces here today. Today I'm going to be sharing some key findings of recent research that we did on voice and agency. The main headline coming out of the book, which was launched by Secretary Clinton last year, is that expanding the voice of women and girls is integral to the global development agenda. When women and girls are able to stand up and be heard, to make decisions that matter to them, to their families, their communities and their nations, everyone benefits. So my remarks here today will have three broad parts. I'll start with some selected highlights from the book about why voice and agency matter and the scale of the challenge, hoping to stimulate your appetite to go and read the book. There are also cards at the back there which give you the easy link to be able to download it for free. Second, I'm going to present some more recent research results which build on the book and look in more detail at some of the correlations we found. And third, and not least, I'll talk about the implications for policies and programs, what we call promising directions. But I do want to start by clarifying what we're talking about. Voice is about women or people being able to stand up and be heard, to shape and share in discussions, discourse and decisions. Agency is about people being able to make decisions that matter to them, about their own lives, about their families, their communities and their countries. What the book does is focus on women and girls, many of whom have no say over, for example, whether, when and how many children to have, who are unable to buy or inherit land, who have no say in major decisions at home in their community, and whom, in their hundreds of millions, have been battered by their husbands. These are major deprivations of agency that both violate human rights and hold back development. In a very basic sense, this is not new. 188 states have outlawed discrimination on the basis of gender in a 1979 convention, CEDAW. the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination. 75 countries have constitutions that outlaw discrimination by gender. So this is the context within which we undertook this research. We were trying to address these challenges building on the 2012 World Development Report put together by the World Bank. One of the basic conclusions of which some of you might recall was that voice and agency is a very important dimension of gender equality, but it was also the dimension on which there'd been the least progress over time. So this was a good motivation to try and get a better handle on what was happening. So in the gender group, we undertook a program of research over about 12 months, complemented by quite extensive consultations, engaged with a number of world experts in the field. So this resulted in the book that you can download for free, and a number of background papers, some of which are now being published in various journals, including The Lancet, Feminist Economics, and elsewhere. This slide presents the table of contents of the book. I'm not going to go into depth in each of these topics today, you might be relieved to know, but you will see that we begin with the cross-cutting issues and then deal with a series of specific challenges, beginning with violence. There's actually a chair here if anyone would like that one. Yeah. In most of the world, no place is less safe for a woman than her own home. What this map does is show regional rates of violence inflicted by intimate partners, that's husbands, boyfriends, which reach as high as 43% in South Asia. The total numbers are startling. Almost 820 million women. That's close to the total population of sub-Saharan Africa, almost triple the population of the United States. These statistics clearly represent enormous human suffering and tragedy. And while human dignity is arguably priceless, intimate partner violence also has a high cost. So to help buttress the arguments about the costs of violence, we undertook work to estimate these. And what we found for a variety of countries that the costs of intimate partner violence range as high as 4% of GDP. That's equivalent to what many countries spend on, for example, primary education. So you look at the case of Peru here, the costs of intimate partner violence are more than double what the country is spending on primary education. It's important to note in terms of our methodology is that we're just looking at productivity losses. So costs due to absenteeism, for example, and reduced hours. We didn't estimate the health costs of treatment, the large damage to mental health and well-being, nor the costs that can be incurred in the judicial system and police and so on. These are just the productivity losses. So the question is, in the light of such enormous losses, why do such widespread breaches of human rights persist? And our major finding is that bad outcomes are being driven by regressive social norms and restrictive laws. And we wanted to see how these regressive norms play out at the household level. So we used the demographic and health surveys for 54 countries, which contain useful insights on this front. Norms like the women themselves accepting violence. It's okay to be beaten by your husband. Having no say in major household decisions like purchases. And being married young, before your 18th birthday. And these are the different deprivations here. Often these are considered separately, but what we wanted to do was to look at the extent, but also the extent to which they overlap at the individual level. And the Venn diagram here illustrates the headline global results. The deprivations are extensive, so 4 out of 5 women suffer at least one of these deprivations across these 54 developing countries, across all income groups, urban, rural, and so on. And that more than 1 in 8 suffer all 3 at the same time. And then behind this global picture, there are countries where the situation is even worse. Here's the example of Niger, where virtually every single woman experiences at least one of these constraints. Only 1% does not face any, and almost half are subject to all 3 at the same time. So as Victoria mentioned, it's important to try and get a handle on what's happening, what's driving these results. And a common factor that we found was little or no educational attainment. What this infographic does is highlight our basic findings around education. That women with primary education or less are much more likely to suffer at least one of those deprivations than women who had at least secondary education or more. Likewise, for those who suffer all three deprivations, you recall that the average was 13%. It's 5% for those who have at least secondary education and 18% for those who have primary or less. I'll come back to the role of education in the next part of the presentation, where we do closer analysis using multivariate techniques. But suffice to say now that we also find that education or lack of education is also strongly related to lack of sexual autonomy and early marriage. So again, analysing these 54 countries, we find that 9 out of 10 university graduates say that they can say no to sex, whereas only 7 out of 10 women with primary education can do so. And here you have some countries which show some particular results. So for example, in Mozambique, Cote d'Ivoire and Cameroon, very large shares of women who have no education being unable to say no to sex. Education is also associated with age of marriage. In fact, girls who finish high school are 6 times less likely to marry early. Far too many girls are wives and mothers. I think that many of you may be familiar with the global picture on this front. Globally, that 1/3 of girls are married before their 18th birthday, 1 in 9 before they turn 15. And as I'll show later, this is also related to increased risks of violence at home. So going back to norms and adverse social norms, clearly this isn't a new idea, but the role of social norms does emerge as very powerful in the research that we did for the book. Social norms in the form of both formal structures of society, so laws and institutions, but also informal prescriptions of behaviour, informal rules, beliefs and attitudes. These norms define what's appropriate and desirable and what's inappropriate. And it's important to note that these are generally shared by both women and men. So for example, the figures that I presented on accepting violence is acceptance of violence by the women themselves. It's not the views of the men. And oftentimes when you look at those, both of those figures for countries, the rates of tolerance are higher among men. And these norms affect day-to-day decisions, but they also reflect major life choices as well. And there are many examples around wife beating, early marriage, and so on. But one point that I just wanted to make now is about how these are reflected in laws. The World Bank undertakes a regular review to assess the extent of discriminatory legislation on the books. Actually, Sarah Iqbal recently presented the most recent results here as part of the WAPPP series, so some of you may recall the highlights. So these legal differences relate to, for example, obtaining an ID card, restrictions on owning or transacting property, establishing creditworthiness, getting a job. In 2013, 128 countries had at least one of these restrictions on the books. 56 countries had at least 5 differences. 28 countries have more than 10. So very extensive extent of legal discrimination around the world. And this gives you a sense about the types of discrimination which are on the books. But as I'll come back to in the last part of the talk, there are signs of hope. Much greater prominence now of addressing legal discrimination, and I think signs of momentum of change and progress on this front now. So turning back now to what we can learn empirically, I wanted to begin by situating this work in the growing literature on measuring women's agency. And this literature has important commonalities. It's very much influenced by the Nobel laureate and Harvard professor Amartya Sen. Not surprisingly, it takes a multidimensional approach. The literature has been very interested in explaining agency and taking care not to equate agency itself with assets. So trying to look at agency itself and then looking at the preconditions for its exercise, like, for example, having education or having access to land. Naila Kabir from SOAS, some of you may be familiar with her work, has done some important work in this area, and she emphasises very much the importance of context. She's done some recent work on pathways to empowerment, which empirically explores patterns in 3 countries and shows the value of this really quite rich approach. There's important work by Sabina Al-Khairi and colleagues at the Oxford and Poverty Human Development Initiative. And she's been trying to get at, again, the conceptual issues, but also measures and trying to capture control and choice. Recent work in Chad, for example, and informing new work on the measurement of women's empowerment in agriculture, for example. So these strands of work are very useful, but what they've done is rely on special surveys for the work that they're doing. And what that means is the country coverage is inevitably limited. So, for example, Nyla's work here is for 3 countries. Sabina's work here, there's detailed work for Chad, for example. The Women Empowerment Index is being done in food insecure areas of a few countries where the US government has programs. So quite limited in terms of coverage. And so because our interest is in global and regional challenges and patterns, we looked around for alternatives. And so one possible way, which initially appears quite attractive, is to use measures which are available, for example, from the Gallup World Poll, which simply asks, do you feel free to live the life that you choose? Which, for those of you who are familiar with Sen's work, is quite similar to the way that he frames freedom and agency. And Gallup asked a question which is quite close to this, and so in theory then, and also because we had access to the microdata, we could get quite a direct measure of agency. The problem, however, is that when you look at the results, they actually don't make sense. And I give the example here of Mali, where in Gallup, the vast majority of women say that they feel very free. More women than men say that they feel free. But we also have data from Mali which shows, for example, very high rates of violence, very high rates of child marriage, and other objective data which suggests that women, in this context, kind of illustrating the problem of what Sen also recognised of adaptive preferences, so framing your situation, your extent of freedom relative to kind of what you know. And this reference group. There's other work, for example, by Carol Graham, who's at Brookings, about the happy peasant and the miserable millionaire. So there's quite a lot of work around this about how kind of a sole reliance on subjective data may not be the best way to go, and it didn't seem to be a sufficiently robust basis for the work that we wanted to do. So in this context, what we concluded is that the best source of data for cross-country analysis is really the demographic and health surveys. Some of you may be familiar with this. They're nationally representative household surveys. They collect information on a wide range of indicators. The indicators importantly relate to what people say they do. So, for example, can you refuse sex? Can you ask your partner to use a condom? Rather than more kind of abstract concepts like, do you feel free? We have data for 57 countries, less for some items of interest. I'll go through that. And we also have countries in the sample which fall into the category of fragile states, as the World Bank calls them, kind of conflict-affected states, which turns out to be quite interesting in the analysis. And so looking at the specific variables that we have, I won't go through all of these in detail, but you can see here kind of what the interesting questions are, how they're framed. We looked at the correlations across these and limited our analysis to those which add value. So we didn't want ones which were too correlated, so correlations of less than 40%. They're around both the attitudes towards violence, for a smaller number of countries, the actual experience of violence, around sexual autonomy, early marriage, and then interesting ones around mobility, being restricted in terms of movement by your husband. Of course, the DHS is not perfect. No data, especially that which has already been collected and available free online, is going to be perfect for the purposes of your own analysis. In our case, I've listed the disadvantages here. They're worth bearing in mind. They weren't fatal, but it's something to take into account as we proceed. So, for example, we don't have any information on girls. It's 15 to 49. We don't have information on girls. We don't have information on income. We have information on assets. I won't go into this in detail, but we can come back to that if you like. So let me just go to kind of the results here and the key deprivation averages for the country groups. This is using the World Bank thresholds in terms of cutoff. Green is low income, lower middle income, and upper middle income. So these are the deprivations that we're looking at: early marriage, condoning violence, experiencing violence, not having control over resource decisions, restrictions on movement, and not being able to ask your partner to use a condom. And you see this broad association here between kind of the country group and these outcomes.
Could you just give quick illustrations of what's low, middle, upper middle?
So low would be most of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, plus Afghanistan and Timor-Leste, for example. Upper middle includes Colombia, Dominican Republic, Peru. And Colombia is actually, these are population weighted, so Colombia kind of affects. And then lower middle income includes, for example, India and so on. But what we see here, I guess not surprisingly, is that the low-income countries generally come out the worst on nearly all dimensions, although you can see on the condom use, it's basically the same as the low and middle income. And the differences are really not very large for this expenditure decision one. This is just to give you a little bit of an initial sense. But here we look at a simple cross-tabulation, looking at different individual level variables. So this is education, location, urban, rural, and wealth quintile, poorest through the richest. So a few things kind of jump out initially, even hopefully for those of you at the back of the room. So education seems very important. So you can see that the rates here for those with no education relative to higher are systematically kind of different across these different ones. So fewer than 1 in 20 university graduates married young compared to 2/3 of those without education. The reported rates of experiencing violence, 42% for those without education, 13% for those who graduated. And the interesting thing here is that even those with only primary education seem to be doing better than those without education. We'll come back to this later on. Looking at the wealth status, you can see that generally that makes a big difference as well across the different deprivations that we're looking at. Location is also a big marker, systematically worse for women in rural areas. An interesting exception is mobility here. So the average is 31, and if you look across the different groups, both for education, rural, urban, and also for the wealth groups, there's actually not much difference here. And so we'll come back to this again very later on. But just to remind you of what the question is, this is where husbands limit contact with friends or family or insist on knowing where she is. So this does seem to imply quite significant restrictions, not varying very much across these sorts of groups. So these initial kind of correlations, I think, are suggestive, and they point to possibly some important factors. So what we try and do is examine this more systematically using econometric analysis. And so what we do is look at kind of 4 sets of characteristics. The women's own characteristics, because we have age, education, so on. We have characteristics of the husband. We have household characteristics, so whether or not it's an extended family situation, and household wealth. And then we have country fixed effects to try and take into account the context, and then a dummy as well for fragile states using the bank's categorization. So we use a logit, so we're looking at the likelihood of experiencing these different deprivations, and we look initially at condom use, expenditure decisions, and mobility, and then we look separately at intimate partner violence. And so looking here at the results, and apologies for the font here, but let me just go through the major results. All these coefficients are significant at the 1% level. So you would normally see kind of triple asterisks here, but that would make it even more difficult to read. So I'm just going to highlight 6 main points, and I'm happy to share the tables with you as well. So the first, and I think quite interesting, is that we have a series of negative findings around marriage. So relative to the base case of living together and not married, being married, either a monogamous or a polygamous marriage, reduces sexual autonomy, and being married as a child further reduces sexual autonomy. The second important point is around education here. So it does confirm that education plays an important role, but I think the important or the interesting point that emerges here is that the effects are especially marked for secondary education and above, not much impact of only primary education. So, for example, in completing secondary education improves sexual autonomy. This is our condom question, 2 to 3-fold. And husband's education is also important, although to a lesser extent. Interestingly, on the husband's one, it's only higher education for husband that makes a positive difference. The other ones don't seem to make much difference. So broadly speaking, if you're just glancing at this, basically if it's over 1, it's worsening, and the lower the number, the better. That's reducing the probability. So that's the way to interpret these coefficients. So, for example, the higher education one here, so 27% as likely as someone with no education to, for example, not be able to use a condom. So basically a lower coefficient is better, higher is worse.
I have a question for work paid outside of the home.
Mm-hmm.
You have paid in kind, paid in cash, or paid in kind and cash.
Mm-hmm.
Are either of those like any sort of one of those direct deposits where it goes into bank accounts or savings?
We don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, in terms of control. But I'll go through those real. So the first ones are around marriage, then education. Third on wealth. So as we saw in the crosstabs, women in richer households are more likely to be able to exercise agency. But interestingly, the impact is not very large. So the way to interpret these coefficients here, which are a little bit less straightforward, but just believe me when I tell you what they mean, is that moving up 1 quintile, so for example from the poorest, from the bottom quintile to the 4th quintile, increases the odds of being able to ask, for example, for a condom by 2%. Which is much less, for example, than the effects that we saw of education, marriage, and so on. The findings around work are quite interesting. And the kind of interesting point here is that economic opportunities seem to actually have quite mixed effects, which is also consistent with what Naila Kabir, for example, found, and that context is important. So being paid in cash increases sexual autonomy and has stronger effects as well on being able to make purchases, presumably because there is this control over cash. So it increases that likelihood by 60 to 70%. But the freedom of movement is actually worse for the women who work. So this suggests controlling behaviour on the part of partners for women who work, which is consistent as well with some of the other research which has been done on intimate partner violence, occasionally in some contexts worsening for women who work. Possibly, yeah.
On that point, 2 or 3 slides back where you showed country wealth, I noted that when country wealth increased, intimate partner control of movement increased. And I wondered if you had a narrative around that. And then how it interplays with this, that as women work, that we're seeing an increase of control of movement.
Those 2 things might be related, but we haven't explored that. The result on worse outcomes or kind of less improvement outcomes as income increase for our sample seems to be driven by Colombia, where there are a lot of controls, and it's a big country in that subsample. So that seems to be what's going on. There are also countries, this is I guess from other work that I've done, Muslim majority countries where there are more controls on work which are moving, doing well, better in terms of kind of income per capita and so on. But it would be kind of interesting to look, to bring those 2 things together, which we haven't actually done yet. In terms of the household characteristics here, there's significant effects, but they're not very large. The female-headed household one is kind of as expected in terms of autonomy. The finding about nuclear people in nuclear families being kind of better off relative to extended families is consistent with other research as well around kind of the role of mothers-in-law having control in the family and so on. And then finally, we have a series of results around the fragile states. And these are quite interesting because the results, again, are significant, but they're mixed. So living in a fragile or conflict-affected state reduces women's sexual autonomy. So it reduces the reported ability of women to ask their partner to use a condom by about a third, but it increases their control over spending decisions at home, and it also increases their mobility. So the likelihood that the husband can control their movement is actually halved. And that again is consistent with some other research about the relaxation of some norms and constraints in post-conflict context by Patty Patesh and others. So let me move along now to the intimate partner violence. Here the analysis is for a subsample of countries which had the question on the actual experience of violence. It's not just the attitudes towards violence. It's 22 countries. I won't list them all. Let me just mention a couple. It includes India, includes Kenya, Nigeria, Tanzania, a few countries in Europe and Central Asia, as well as in Latin America, Colombia again, for example. The independent variables that we had are basically the same as before, but we have some additional controls. So we have husband's alcohol use, we have experience of violence as a child, and we have information, external information about whether or not there's a law on the books in the country against violence. And the findings that we have are broadly consistent with the literature, including a recent meta-analysis by Karen DeVries and colleagues that was published in Science last year. So key risk factors include alcohol. So if the husband's often drunk, 5 times more likely. Women's own attitudes towards violence are very important. Their exposure as children is very important, again, confirming earlier research. The circumstances of marriage matter. So being married young as well as being in a polygamous relationship increase the risk of IPV by around 20%. And living in a fragile or conflict-affected state increases the likelihood of intimate partner violence by about a third. But we do also have, so they're all quite consistent with the existing literature. We also have, I think, some additional findings which are a bit more nuanced I just wanted to mention. Again, around education, what we find is that it has a protective effect, but it's only evident at the secondary levels and above. It's not evident for primary and below. And again, it's with higher education for men, not primary or secondary education. Living in a richer household does make a difference, but the effect again is not huge. It's less than 2%. It's only 1.5% moving to the next richest quintile. And then finally, and interestingly, and something that we have in the book as well, is that people who live in, or women who live in countries where there's domestic violence legislation in place are less likely to face violence, 7% less likely to be subject to violence. So, in sum, completing secondary education and beyond has consistently large positive impacts, so that underlines the post-2015 development agenda kind of pushing beyond primary schooling. The expansion of agency does have positive links with the poverty reduction and economic growth agenda, but clearly alone it's not enough. Women living in richer households are more likely to be able to exercise agency, but the impact is not as large as education, for example, as I mentioned. And women's own economic opportunities and earned income can have positive effects, but again, possibly not as large as expected and with mixed results for mobility, as we saw. And then the final thing just to highlight from the econometric results is the importance of child marriage, and that being associated with the increased probability of these various deprivations, which again supports the increased international attention on this pervasive phenomenon. So, the picture is, I think, very sobering. Indeed, in some ways, I think the evidence, this empirical evidence about the extent and the overlap of agency deprivations is quite shocking. But the good news is that promising directions are emerging, and what I want to do in the final part of the presentation is just highlight some recent experiences that show how change can come about. The broad areas that we cover in the book in Chapter 2 and elsewhere are outlined on this slide. Given the centrality of social norms in shaping behaviour and outcomes, we were especially interested in promising directions in changing norms. And you can find more details in the book. I'll just highlight some selective examples here. One kind of cross-cutting finding, if you like, is the importance of broad-based participation in the change process. So men and boys, community leaders, family elders can be key allies and stakeholders. And in fact, programs that are limited and engage only women are more likely to bring more partial results. And we have examples about interventions engaging early with boys and highlight some success stories from around the world. So what about some specific examples? Here I'm just going to highlight less than a handful, but there are, I think, a growing number of promising approaches that are being both tried but also rigorously evaluated around the world. Tostan is one that's a community empowerment program tackling female gender mutilation in Senegal, now operating in literally hundreds of African communities and working towards change. Program P is part of the global Men Engage campaign, and it's promoting changes in norms among men, and particularly young men, around masculinity, caregiving, violence, and so on. And then there's more recent results from SASA from Uganda showing how community engagement around changing gender norms can be very successful in reducing rates of violence, actually halving rates of violence in that case. And you can find fuller details and other examples in the book. What we also see is that there's change on the legal front, and that progressive laws and their enforcement can help to create change. That legal guarantees of gender equality are expanding, and I've mentioned CEDAW already, and how these can be used as tools, including by women's groups, to promote change at the country level. These international agreements call on countries to implement rights in domestic law, which many countries have done. And many more constitutions now than prior to, for example, 1995 include guarantees for gender equality, although a number of them still have exceptions for traditional and customary law. And just to show this graph here, which again is taken from Women, Business and the Law, this is the number of countries which have laws on the books against domestic violence, which has risen from 1 in 1976 to 76 in 2010. However, only fewer than 40 of these countries, actually only 38, have specific laws tailor-made to address marital rape and rape within marriage. So this is kind of domestic violence more broadly. Not all of these countries have specific provisions against rape. Of course, laws alone are not enough, but they are an important start and they can make a difference. And we saw that in the econometric analysis about having the laws on the books seeming to be associated with reduced probability of violence.
Do the legal reforms provide equality for both men and women with regard to domestic violence?
Oftentimes, but these ones here are focused on women, but the ones that I'm familiar with normally have both. The other finding from the book about the laws, which is not surprising, is that the longer the legislation is in place, that makes a difference as well. And then finally here across the policy areas, I just wanted to highlight some results from the work that we did with colleagues at George Washington University. So we recently completed the first global systematic review of reviews of evidence on the effects of gender-based violence prevention. This has just been published in The Lancet as part of their special series. And what the review did was identify 179 impact evaluations, with the caveat that the vast majority of these are actually from developed countries and the vast majority of those from the US. So it highlights the importance here of more systematic efforts to evaluate interventions in developing countries to document what works. But I think there are some important findings which are quite robust, including for developing countries, that emerge. And then on the prevention side, these are the key findings here about targeting both men and women, having multiple components, deliberately addressing norms, involving the wider community, and spanning longer time periods. They found a number of interventions that were really very short in time, maybe a 1-month radio campaign or something that was really quite brief in duration. And all of those, I think, bar one, were not shown to work, not surprisingly, again, but I think underlining the importance of sustained efforts. And then finally, but not least, and something to which I've already alluded, is that change requires more embedded data and new measures to track progress. So we can learn what's making a difference and so that we can be held to account. And on the agency front in particular, gender equality, there are a number of gaps on the data side, and I've already alluded to those. But here again, I think there is good news. Agreement has been reached at the international level on core indicators, which include some aspects which are interesting from an agency point of view, and internationally agreed indicators on violence against women have also been agreed. So there's a dozen of those. The methodology and the protocols and so on have been developed, and those are now being piloted by UN Women. So I think that kind of the basis is there in terms of standardisation to enable, I think, some of these key gaps to be able to move forward. And then to complement these kind of broader indicators, it's clearly very important to have the evidence about what works and what doesn't work. We launched last year at the World Bank the Gender Impact site, which brings together knowledge about this, including on violence, and that's part of translating research into action, which is very much part of the WAPPP mandate. And another example, of course, is the Gender Action Portal, which is extremely valuable in bringing this evidence to bear in what we do. So let me stop here, and I'll welcome your questions and feedback. Should I stay here?
Wherever you'd like to be. Is your
Well, there's no chair, so I guess I will.
I thought an interesting from the initial part that you showed was how women so along education, there's really no difference in restriction of movement, but you have this distinction in partner violence and acceptance. But restriction of movement is a form of intimate partner violence, and it's through control, right, and fear that's perpetrated. And so it's not clear to me that that's actually a difference in the levels or levels of condoning, but rather a difference in reporting and the stigma attached to it. I'm not sure if you have.
No, I think that's a really good point. And unfortunately, I think they'll kind of design with different kind of motivations in mind. Because it's a DHS, they also have questions about whether or not you can go to a health facility and so on your own. And so they weren't really connecting it to kind of controlling behaviour in the way that intimate partner violence is. But I think it's a good point. It'd be good to make the link and then see how that works as well. Especially since there seem to be different factors going on with mobility as well. So to understand that. There's a lot of hands. So I'll just go around and then come back.
Hi, I work in Western Nepal where a lot of women can't even recognize that what's happening to them is marital rape or sexual violence.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, when do you see a switch between a gender-based violence law being put in place and the recognition of I have a right to report, or I have the resources available to go report this? Is it the law, or is it more of the education system waiting for it to catch up?
Well, the reporting rates are still terribly low. You know, they're in single digits. There's actually a discussion about that in the book in chapter 3. So we have, so there's a bunch of countries where the laws are on the books where in single digit percentages women are reporting rape. And there's also questions actually asking them why they don't report. And so sometimes it's kind of shame and stigma. Sometimes it won't make any difference. Sometimes it's because they don't know where to go. But we have some analysis of that. But I think there's a huge gap between having the law in place and reporting. But there may be an interim step where there's awareness that it's a bad thing. So, for example, I was actually looking earlier this week at the Gallup data because they have questions on, do you think a rape should be reported to the police? Because I thought that would be kind of interesting and there'd be a lot of country variation. And I looked at a bunch of countries and it was all in the 90s. So very high. So in theory, people, I think, in a whole range of countries realise that it's illegal and it's a bad thing. This is including marital rape. But they're not going the next step to report it. So I think understanding how that comes about in practice is really very important. There are criticisms of kind of criminal justice-based approaches, but I think laws do create a very important signal in terms of kind of what's acceptable and not acceptable. But if you look in the book, you can see the stuff about reporting and why people don't report. I think this one.
Hi, I had a question. Thank you for your presentation. I'm not sure if I missed it on your slide, but was there a correlation between access to contraception and mobility and sense of agency in terms of childbearing having an impact on mobility?
We didn't look at that one directly here. So it's
access to contraception. You talked about condom use,
Mhm.
but I'm just thinking generally, is there a correlation for women to sort of exercise agency over their bodies through access to contraception, which, you know, the number of children that a woman has impacts her capacity for mobility.
Mhm.
So I wondered if that played a role in any of the work that you came across, or if it was a
Yeah, no, so we did look at that in chapter 4 in the book is on sexual and reproductive health that I didn't really talk very much separately about today. And so access to contraception is clearly important. And there are different sources here. So you can use the DHS, you can also use, say, Guttmacher, which has these estimates of unmet need. And I think there are important kind of correlations there that we do explore, but we didn't kind of link it directly here to fertility and kind of birth spacing and stuff. We were looking more at kind of whether or not women felt that they had the capacity to be able to say no, say no to sex, and then also ask a partner to use a condom. So it was kind of more in terms of kind of decision-making power. I think, yeah, Hella, then 2 down here.
Just kind of off of that, did you look at the correlation between women's, the number of children women have, or women without children, or versus with children, and the correlation with mobility and experiences?
Yeah, we did. We've got, although I haven't fully digested, we have, there's a question on actual and desired number of children in the DHS, and then we have number of kids as well. But I don't think it came out as particularly important. So number of kids here. So they're better off in terms of purchases and worse off in terms of movement. Not significant here on the condom one. And then the difference between the ideal and actual number of children. I have expensive children, and they're worse off there. But that's another. You know, I think that there's more that can be done, and I'd encourage you all to kind of think about kind of research questions in this area. There's much more to do. So here and then back.
So I come from an education background, so I'm really pleased to see the effect of education and protecting women. However, I'm sort of wondering, at some time, is it a cause or is it an effect? So if a family wanted to marry their child off early, then she wouldn't be able to go to school. Or if the country is not supportive of women's rights in general, they may not allow girls to go to school.
Yeah. No, so I think at the macro level I showed kind of the patterns of child marriage and patterns of enrolment, and the fact that girls who finish high school are much less likely to be married, but there's obviously causality kind of problems there. You don't really know what's driving what. At the same time, we can look at on the actually the early marriage one is not there. When you look at kind of more careful work looking at what's going on is going to have to work out kind of what contextual factors are actually making a difference. So some of them have to do with kind of norms about marriage, as well as norms about the values of girls' education and economic opportunities and a whole bunch of things. So I think that you're right. But I think that for the education camp, if you like, there's a lot of other good evidence here in terms of education. I think on the child marriage specifically, it is a bit tricky in terms of the causality. I think you're right. Caroline, and then we'll come to, yeah.
I come from Kenya, and I just want to understand when you say that women who are educated say no to sex more, and there are so many media awareness campaigns that keep on happening, and I'm wondering if there is any correlation between, if I'm educated, I feel like I have the pressure to say that I can say no to sex versus willingly saying, because relating to the same question that she asked, I think using myself as a good example, it's very hard to determine the difference between marital rape and all those things. So it's just something very you're able to relate the awareness campaign versus educated people just saying no because they feel obliged.
No, it's a good question. I mean, we don't have the kind of qualitative information or analysis to really kind of fully understand what's going on. It does seem, though, that if there are awareness campaigns, they're making more of a difference for more educated women. But, overall it could be making a difference as well. But remember, in the regressions, it's controlling for other stuff, right? So it's controlling for income and location and these other observables that we have as well. Hi.
I have one comment and one question. I want to comment on Lindsay's question about the laws versus raising awareness and reporting rape. And one of the things that we saw in Sierra Leone was that it's a good case study because they had laws on domestic violence on the books, very low reporting rates and awareness around rape. And one of the factors that really bumped those reporting rates up was a program that was done by the IRC that trained the police and then actually created units at the police for reporting sexual violence. And so these special centers with specially trained personnel, often women, really increased, and that was done in conjunction with a huge campaign across media on raising awareness. And I think you mentioned the fact there of actually many different programs working together with the same goal, and it's just that physical infrastructure that women knew that they could go to a police station, not be confronted by a male police officer who wasn't specifically trained, and so that it was a less intrusive kind of process. And we've seen now a huge bump in
reporting.
So kind of interesting case study. I had a question. You mentioned customary law. Did you run the numbers, singling out the countries that have dual legal systems with the customary law? Again, Sierra Leone, many of the West African countries, they have, you'll see customary law, of course, in parallel two systems. Did you see a difference there in domestic violence and some of the other factors that you pulled out?
No, it's a good idea. We didn't do that. But we could, because we have from Women, Business and the Law that says whether or not there's a constitutional exception for customary law, which I think exists in about a dozen African countries, if not more. So we could do that. Right. It might be quite interesting. The sample might be a little bit small to be able to work out whether or not it's significant.
But yeah, I think it has been that's been raised as a factor. I think of customary law, presence of customary law.
Thank you so much. I was really struck by the figures of the loss in productivity as a percentage of GDP. And I was wondering if you could, first of all, talk a little bit more about how that's calculated, how that data arises. You mentioned it was just a function of absenteeism, people not going to work. And then secondly, do you have any thoughts on if you were to factor in things like costs of health care resulting from that violence or psychological effects, a more holistic?
So in the countries where we have that data, there's special surveys which are done. So in Tanzania, Vietnam, Peru, they actually did surveys of women, and so it included experience of violence, and it asked them whether or not they were missing work. One problem with the estimates that I didn't mention before is that for poorer women or women who are not working, the measured costs are lower, which is kind of, I think, a little bit problematic, but it's just something to bear in mind. So basically it was a survey, so we knew both whether or not the women had been beaten up and then how many days of work she missed.
So it was self-reporting?
It was, self-reporting by the women. And so there's two background papers. There's one on Tanzania, and there's another one by Nata Duvray, which is Vietnam and a few other countries as well. So basically what it does is does the survey, then you look at the overall kind of prevalence rates, and then you have, the sectors in which women work and so on, and then you can estimate, I guess, somewhat heroically, what the economic costs are. But they are on the low side, I think, if anything, and conservative. There's actually a it was available and we cite it in the book, another study that's actually published in Fiscal Studies of the UK, and what they did there was kind of more of a Amartya Sen type approach, so it was kind of capabilities and loss of capabilities and so on, and mental well-being, and their estimate is 10% of GDP. Taking all of that into account. So it's not difficult. When you have prevalence rates of their lifetime prevalence rates, but 1 in 3 women, it's not hard to get to kind of relatively large numbers in terms of cost. So in the fiscal studies one, they had questions around. I think they're partly around kind of perceived loss of freedom and autonomy among the women who are getting beaten up, and then they somehow also had kind of questions around kind of depression and mental illness and stuff, which is one of the I think kind of well-known, well-documented consequences of gender-based violence, and then it comes out very large. So, but the fiscal studies one is one that I think I don't know whether it's a gold standard, but it kind of gives you a better sense of kind of the total costs for the UK. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this. I have kind of a more stepped-back question.
Mm-hmm.
First is much of his work was done while you were at the World Bank, and this is really research that strikes me as quite atypical for the bank, in the sense of the strong focus on violence and actually relatively little focus on what are the productivity, economy, and so on. And the link was made in the World Development Report, but still, I was kind of wondering. I mean, was it easy to justify to do this work? Did you kind of get pushback in the bank of people saying, you know, what the hell does this have to do with economic development or growth or things of that nature? That's my first question. And the second question is, there's a lot of weight in this study put on institutions and social norms as kind of the main culprits, if you will. And there is no responsibility put it all on markets. On markets. And of course the bank is all about believing in markets and making markets work and so on. And the assumption is that markets in a way are by definition not discriminatory. And so my question there, I mean, if you particularly start to think about, like for example, thinking about education and the way in which once you impute the cost of discrimination in all of these issues, aren't you in a sense encouraging a thinking around utility and whether something is profitable in terms of violence? I mean, on the one hand, it's one thing to say, as economists, you know, there are costs associated to it. But in a sense, you know, especially if you talk about violence against women, you know, and you have, it's in a sense the point of view of, well, should violence against women be justified? No, that's not a good way to put it. It is in the end, does one not in the end encourage thinking about women and violence being worth it if, for example, they don't have as much education or if they don't have as much endowments or whatnot? So the point of view is really kind of one from the perspective of the male, in a sense, of you know, what needs to be in place in order for violence to be worth it or not to be worth it, or to not engage in violence. So like they don't engage in violence or are endowed in a certain sense. So I mean, it's a matter of logic, and you know, I know you're also a lawyer, and why not kind of use the human rights perspective more extensively on these things, and why do we have to link it back all to economic rationality in the end?
So let me have a go at those. I think that on the kind of undertaking the work, the fact that the World Development Report had just been done, you know, was a platform. So it was there and it was kind of out there. So I think that gave us a good basis to be able to move forward. And I think that when you look at the WDR, frankly, it's a bit thin on the voice and agency side in terms of what the implications are for policies and programs. So that was quite a good motivation for us to pick that up. So that's on the one hand. And then on the other hand, there was an increasing amount of interest from colleagues working at the country level, at the regional level in these issues, because they were seeing the ways in which, for example, with an employment program, it doesn't really work because the agency and the aspirations of the girls and the women who are participating ostensibly in a vocational training program limits what they're able to do with the technical training. So I think an increasing realisation of how, the potential complementarities and the importance of agency in terms of realising kind of broader development goals, even if we're only concerned about income and we're not concerned about anything else, unless you think about agency. So thinking about it purely from an instrumental point of view, it does make a difference. So you can argue whether or not they're coming, they're not coming at it the same way you or I would, but they're still appreciating the importance of the issue, especially when you start talking about these sorts of magnitudes, which I think are really quite shocking, and people realise, okay, so many of the clients in our countries, the female clients in our countries are facing, these sorts of constraints in their everyday lives. So we have to think about, if they can't go out, how are they going to be able to take advantage of, either using public services or seeking work and so on. And when in the book, what we tried to do was to highlight that the implications are really quite multi-sectoral. So it doesn't mean that the bank should be doing violence programs everywhere, but when it has, for example, an economic opportunities program or maybe a health program or a judicial reform program, we can be thinking about violence in that context as well, for example. So thinking about ways in which, and education is another one, so when we looked at the different programs which the bank did, we weren't really doing anything on education that was trying to address social norms kind of issues very directly. So we could make quite direct recommendations kind of to the bank in terms of programming about kind of the relevance of the work. And I think it was a receptive audience and a lot of interest in the work. So we'll just see, how it goes in terms of how it proceeds. The bank is actually doing some big projects now on GBV. So there's a big one. There has been a big one in Brazil that was actually included as part of a development policy loan. There's a big one in Democratic Republic of Congo. There's big reproductive sexual health programs now in the Sahel, including in Niger. So I think it's an area that's kind of gaining momentum, but I guess we'll see what happens. And then on your second question, I'm not sure whether I fully got it, but I guess maybe because I'm an economist and a lawyer, I'm kind of a bit of a pragmatist as well. And I think that I think the human rights and intrinsic arguments are very important, but if they're not getting you anywhere, you've got 188 countries have signed up to CEDAW, and we've got these sorts of kind of very overt discriminations and breaches of human rights going on in so many countries in the world. So calling that out I think is important, but also pointing out why it's bad from a development point of view is something that can be usefully done as well. And the figures that we got, we got a lot of good kind of media pickup and attention from the report. And one of the things that was really picked up was these figures on GDP, as a share of GDP. So I think that it's like doing estimates of productivity losses or losses to national income from women not participating in the labour market, so you can kind of think about whether or not you kind of agree with, why or how it's being done. But I think if it's getting kind of the message out there and bringing attention, it's worth doing with policymakers. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think you can push both, so there's 3 also.
I was interested when you were talking about what has been proven to work and what's most successful, that it put an emphasis on programs for men and women.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess my question is 2 parts. The first being, is the emphasis on and women, meaning sort of men's programs are more important, or the opposite, that women's programs are sort of front and center, but
right.
also include men. We're just wondering what the kind of balance was there.
Mm-hmm.
And also, sort of as a part of that, has any of the research in this book looked at the impact of sort of feminist organizations and groups within the countries under question, and working with those groups, or is it more about sort of women who are not in any way politically associated with a movement or a kind of collective in their community? Is it more about sort of individual women and men within families?
So on the first one, it kind of depends. And so some of the programs that I mentioned, for example, the Promundo one, the program P is kind of with men. It's working with young men. Yeah. There are other examples, like the SASA one, is my understanding, is it's more community level. So, I mean, you may have separate groups and you may bring them together. So it's going to be very context specific. I think the kind of the underlying point is that changing kind of norms and attitudes only among women is unlikely to be enough. So you have to work out ways in order to make that more broadly shared in terms of change. But what makes sense will depend, I think, very much on the specific context. And I think in a number of cases it's actually done separately, and in some cases it's done together. It kind of depends, and it depends on the context as well. We actually have I didn't talk about it all today, but chapter 6 in the book is on amplifying voices, and that's a lot about grassroots women's movements and so on, and very much highlighting their importance, certainly in terms about bringing about kind of progressive legal reform, as well as in terms of accountability. And a number of examples there, so you can see that. But I didn't mention that at all today.
Two quick questions. You mentioned the importance of progressive laws and their enforcement.
Uh-huh.
I was wondering if your logic model unpacked that, because what's come up in this room is just the difference between those. So the laws are on the books, but if they're not enforced, there's probably a dramatic impact on reporting, and that trickles down and trickles up. So in terms of, I guess, would be the next slide.
Yeah. Well, we don't have one actually on enforcement, because I think it's actually quite difficult to measure. What we did have was the length of time that the laws have been in place, I guess implicitly on the assumption that the longer they've been in place, possibly the more likely
well, it's interesting
they are.
That like the power of norms feeds back, because laws can be, if there's not a synergy between laws and the norms, then the enforcement is not there. So there's sort of an interest.
No, exactly. I mean, the example that I think we give in the book as well is Bangladesh has, I think, rates of child marriage of like 71%, and it's been illegal since 1924. So, yeah. So that's kind of. But then you do have kind of more positive examples. So, it's. I think it gets back to the question as well about kind of training and the police and the judicial system and so on as well, to make it more receptive. But we didn't really have a good kind of cross-country measure. The only one we had was how long the law had been in place, which does make a difference. So, but that could have to do with awareness rather than enforcement. We don't really know what's going on.
And I think one interesting thing to note around awareness is also consequence. When most women, if they're reporting inter-household violence in some way, and intimate partner violence, there's going to be a consequence beyond the legal consequence for that reporting. And so, like, what are the structures, what are the avenues and mechanisms that women have? Is that their sole source of income? I mean, I think it's really sort of multifold, and whether that's playing out in one of the developing countries, talked about in the report, or whether that's playing out even in countries with really low intimate partner violence rates comparatively, like the US. It's that whole constellation of factors, in addition to the reporting, in addition to the awareness, that really drive where the rubber meets the road in terms of policy that's being implemented.
So I guess that's as well, when we commissioned the systematic review, we deliberately focused on prevention rather than responses, because given kind of the scale of the challenge and given the underreporting, getting at the prevention side is going to have much larger kind of payoffs.
If you can get that right, the intervention won't be needed. So
less needed. So there's one here, and then Charles.
I was just really going to pick up on this kind of how you frame the argument question, and also I liked your idea of kind of getting you thinking about, like, how do you use this report? It was so interesting to me. The thing is, Sarah Iqbal your colleague came and presented on the effective laws and how do you persuade some of these countries. And she was describing how one of the most persuasive things to get people to change some of the laws was showing them that actually some of these laws were not actually based on customary law or culture, but rather actually these are just right out of
some colonial thing.
Colonial stuff. These are colonial vestiges, and when they kind of explained these were colonial vestiges, there was this willingness to kind of let go of these things. So it's sort of an interesting, it's a different argument than a pure self-interest or economics argument. And And another interesting thing, just picking on stuff from the seminar, Robert Jenkins, the guy from Wharton, he's done this really fascinating research showing that when you, and this goes back to your education thing that I wonder about. Backing up for 1 second on the education thing, another theme people have been talking about is, is it education or what is it? Is it education or is it economic power, frankly, right? So Robert Jenkins had this really interesting thing where he made available to certain rural villages in India advertisements about, or access to call center jobs for young girls, and actually showed that related to like weight gain for girls and the number of hours that they had to do housework and their education and stuff. And so it seemed like what they were perceived as was just economically valuable, right? And so education could also not be raising people's awareness necessarily or changing social norms, but simply just giving them more bargaining power, Anyways, I just wonder, going back to like Sarah's argument, and this is the thing, pointing out the colonial vestiges seemed to be the thing that was turning it. What do you feel like are some of the most persuasive arguments, either on the prevention side or the policy change side, that are making a difference? Is it normative stuff? Is it about get fathers involved in the household, or do you think that this raising awareness of women's potential economic contributions? I'm just curious what you think is most persuasive across different contexts, or.
Well, I think it depends who you're talking to. So
Yeah,
if it's
course,
kind
yeah.
of ministers of finance, we had a finance minister, community of practice. And there, would be much more around the economic costs, the fiscal costs, and potential productivity gains. If you're talking to women's groups, it has to be much more kind of rights-based and focused on those sorts of areas. So I don't think there's an overall.
No. I'm just curious.
So I think it varies depending on context. I think that the comparisons can help, like the peer comparisons. So showing outliers. By region or, within a particular group can help. But also showing good practices as well. So there's the kind of shaming, but then there's also, if you like, kind of showing the feasibility, I think, both of change and, how it can benefit. And especially when it comes within relatively short periods of time, I think kind of demonstrating how that can be done. But I think that the tricky thing is that clearly there are kind of major underlying structural constraints. And so we can look at some of the programs which have appeared to work, but clearly as well it's a long-term, agenda. So we need to counsel, I think, patience as well as effort, in order to be able to move the agenda forward. So it's a bit of a balance. There are some low-hanging fruit, but then, there are major trees out there as well, which might be in the way. So it's going to be a big challenge.
Forgive me, I just want to follow up. I think so. Part of the answer to your question is it's going to depend on the audience. It's going to depend on that it's very contextual and that it requires a multi-pronged agenda. And so in certain contexts, what's most persuasive and compelling and important, maybe even grassroots, being around these normative arguments, but then for moving, it's going to depend on the logic of the community, and what's most persuasive to them, I imagine.
Yeah.
Because your logic doesn't seem to be simply economic, it's really multidimensional.
Yeah. No, well, hopefully it's a bit of a smorgasbord, so people can choose what they would like. Charles, I think maybe the last one.
This might be beyond the scope of the data you have in research, but it seems like a lot of your observational data comes from heterosexual married women. I wonder if you had any data looking at lesbian, bisexual, or trans women, and if not, how you think that identification might confound your variables.
As far as I know, the DHS doesn't collect that one, and it would be really interesting to look at. I think depending on how they're kind of self-identifying or how many are, you might run into. I mean, one of the reasons why we get such powerful results is that we've got really big sample sizes here, which kind of helps with the kind of power, getting kind of significant results. But I think it's an area which is really, I think, underexplored, particularly for women, I think, even probably more so than for men. But you can imagine, I guess it depends on the context, the household context and the community context, and there'd be a bunch of other things that would kind of matter as well. But as far as I know, I don't think, does anyone know whether the DHS has those questions? I don't think it does, no? Yeah.
And I think in a lot of these countries, those samples are going to be really, really small.
In terms of people identifying it, reporting, Yeah, so I think it would become tricky. I think the way to start would be doing more qualitative work, focus group work and stuff, somehow maybe working with civil society and so on, and then trying to work it out, and then on that basis some kind of research strategy. But starting this, I don't think this quantitative data would help you very much.
But I know the World Bank just finished a report on the economic costs of homophobia in India. And one of the groups they looked at specifically was women.
Yeah.
So lesbian, bisexual, trans women.
Yeah, and I was involved a bit in that when it was getting started. Yeah.
Jeni, thank you
Sure.
so much for such an incredible talk. And next Thursday, Jennifer Berdahl, the Montalbano Professor of Leadership Studies from Gender and Diversity from the University of British Columbia Sauder School of Business, will be here to discuss from sexual harassment to selective...
I have a few of these in my office, so if you really want a glossy copy, I can probably scratch one up for you.
So if you can put that up maybe in the... It's already there, of course.
Yeah, and there are postcards there. And